homicides. So feel free to ask questions. Remember, if you are a school provider, please let us know how many people are in the classroom with you. That's really useful information, and any feedback is greatly appreciated. So I hope you enjoy the session, and I'll leave you with Howard on the screen.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. As Ash says, my name's Dr Howard Atkin. Currently, I work for the University of Huddersfield as a senior lecturer in policing. Prior to that, I was a police officer for 34 years, principally in West Yorkshire, although I worked all over the world, 30 countries worldwide. I was mainly a detective, and a lot of my duties revolved around serious and organised crime and serious crime like homicides and rapes. I was a senior investigating officer. That's a formal role. That's somebody who leads these major investigations. I was also a senior investigation review officer, which meant I was used to review the investigations of other senior officers and try and figure out how we could have done it better. And as part of that, I did a range of academic study, including my PhD, which was in cold case homicides. So that's kind of my background. If you Google me, you'll find me on the good old Tinterweb. Now, can I just check before I start? Can people see the actual PowerPoint slides? Yes? No? Oh, thank you. Good. What I'm going to be talking about today, like Ash says, is something around the investigation of homicide, and particularly cold case homicides. Now, don't worry. Like Ash says, it's a sensitive subject, but I'm not going to be showing gory pictures and things like that. So for those of you who are hoping for that, I'm sorry if you're disappointed. But what I want to talk to you about is to set the scene around homicide and what it really is from a police point of view and a societal point of view. Now, one definition of homicide, and there are many, is the killing of a human being by another human being. But the key point is with malice aforethought. Now, I know that's old-fashioned language. What that means is person A kills person B, not by accident. Example, run you down by a car, or you throw a rock and it hits somebody in the head by accident and they're dead. That's something else. You meant to kill them, you intended to kill them, so you set out to kill them, and after you've killed them, you're happy with what you've done, if that makes sense, or you've achieved what you want. And that criminal intent is the difference between homicide and all the other kinds of ways in which we kill people, and there are many. Now, just to set the scene for you about homicide in terms of how it impacts on society, here are some statistics. The graph shows dark blue lines are males, light blue are females. So if you're male or female, you can see how you figure in this. This is the kind of murderers who commits the most murder by proportion. You can see if it's an ex-partner, it tends to be females who kill males rather than males who kill females. If it's family, it's about 50-50. Friends and acquaintances and strangers or unknowns, it tends to be predominantly males. And overall, more males commit murder statistically than females. So you may want to look around your classroom colleagues and think, that's interesting. Where do murders actually take place? Now, a murder isn't just the place where, I don't know, Captain Scarlet hits somebody with an iron bar in the sitting room. That's the site where the murder takes place, but there are actually other sites, preparation sites, places where the murderer might first encounter the victim, so they're going to follow them. After they've killed them, there may be a different site where they deposit the body. So one murder doesn't always have one criminal site, it has several. But this one here is talking about where the murder actually committed. And you see again, predominantly murders are committed in the home, and when they are, it's generally females killing males rather than males killing female. By contrast, murders outside tend to be committed by males rather than females. Method of homicide. What do they use to kill somebody? Again, by victims. The colours this time are the victims, not the murderers, the committers of the crime. You can see a lot of sharp instrument, and again, that's mainly male. Hitting or kicking, physical injury, again, primarily male. Shooting, the same. But then strangulation and blunt instrument, whether that be a frying pan or whatever, tends to be female more than male. You'll notice as well in all these categories that there's always an unknown. That's where the investigation never actually discovered the location of the murderer, what the relationship of the murderer to the victim was, or the kind of weapon. We don't always have absolute solutions in homicides. I'd just like to touch on some numbers to kind of set the scene for you. Every year, we detect, the police, obviously I'm not a police officer anymore, nationally, we detect about 80% of homicides. Now that's pretty good. Most other crime types we detect far less. Now, part of the reason for that is the police invest a lot more resources and a lot more expertise into homicides because it's a violent crime. It's a serious crime. It's the most serious, arguably, that somebody could commit, taking the life of another. But even so, that results in 20% being undetected every year. When you look at the way that forces record homicides, again, that's a problem. When I've studied this, the oldest cold case, and that's what they call undetected homicides. I don't like the term, but it's a common one. You can watch it on TV, cold case. The oldest reported case is 1866. Now, a force has kept a record of a homicide from 1866. Imagine me, here we are in 2022. If I was going to reinvestigate that homicide by looking at the original investigation, how likely is it I'm going to be able to detect a homicide that was committed in 1866? They had no idea of forensics then. All the witnesses will be dead. The records won't be anything like the records that we use today. So the way that forces record and retain the records of homicides has a massive impact on the ability of cold case investigators to go back and look at those cases later on, either in isolation or even as a group. This 20% a year stacks up over the years. Currently, there are just over 1,150 unknown, undetected homicides in the UK. These are the ones that we know about. So if you think about it, on the one hand, it can be reassuring to think, oh, well, the police detect 80% of homicides, that's good. But the truth is, because we don't detect them all, we have now almost 1,200 homicides that are undetected across the UK. And when you look at it through that lens, that's quite concerning. And the other point I would make, as the slide shows, it's not concentrated in any one force area. 42 out of the 43 UK police forces who record homicide report having homicides that are over a year old, thus cold cases. So it's across the whole of the UK. It's a national issue. It's not something located at one part of the country. Why are these important? Well, if you think about it, with the cold case, like the 1866 one, time has an impact. The older the case, not only do you lose the value of the information you can collect, but the police officer's skill set is lost. Police officers, look at me, I did 34 years. I've been retired nearly 7 years. So my knowledge is no longer as available to the police service about old cases, old systems of recording, as it was when I was a serving police officer. Over time, the police service, like any big organisation, changes things that impact our awareness of homicide, like the way it records or retains those homicides. If that changes, you can't recover that information. It can be lost forever. So there's a danger over time that the colder, if you will, a case gets, if the forces aren't careful about how they retain material, the less becomes their ability to go back and reinvestigate it and hopefully solve that crime, maybe in the light of new evidence or new forensic techniques or something like that. The second thing is, I've talked about variability. If you were looking at, say, a series of homicides, something like the Yorkshire Ripper, when they were committed in multiple force areas, if another force area didn't record those offences as well as the force area you're working from, your ability to look for a pattern across them is limited by your access to the data, simply because a different force might not have recorded everything in the detail you might have wished to have. The third thing is environmental change. believe it or not, the way of the world and how society changes and adapts can impact on these things. There are changes in the law recently, things like double jeopardy, justice after acquittal. At one point, they were talking about suing police forces, giving people the right to sue police forces if they failed to detect crimes. Now, that's a big issue for a police force as well as an individual investigator, because clearly if they have to set aside money to fight legal cases or to contest them, then they're not spending that same money on other policing services. More recently, you'll have seen very recently the media reports, and they were media driven, of people who were not police officers trying to reinvestigate murders on the on Saddleworth Moor between Yorkshire and Lancashire, where some of the Ian Brady victims were allegedly buried. And there were reports where this reporter basically and a team had found the site of a missing body, a body that was believed to have been killed by Ian Huntley. That's not actually turned out to be the case. But again, it's not just the police who have an interest and investigate these cold cases. We have far more information out there on the internet and available to people to form their own ideas. Now, the other thing is current cases. What happens is when a murder is committed or an unexplained death, the police get involved and they assume it's a murder. Now, obviously, they will investigate that in current time. If a murder happened today and I was assigned to it, I would throw resources at it and investigate it quickly because the evidence and the information is fresh. However, if they're not detected, then obviously as new murders are committed, the cold case murders are put onto what you might think of as a back burner. It's called investigative maintenance. We're not actually doing lots of work on it because we haven't got all the resources. And you just almost put it to one side and let it tick over unless new information or new evidence comes to light. So it gets a lower and a different level of investigation because we can't do everything on every case as we would like. It's just the reality of the world and resources. Now, as a result of that, as I say, if you can imagine 140 cold cases a year, they're still on police officers and the police forces workloads. And that proportion of homicides is getting bigger every day. So you've got this clash between investigators investigating current murders that have just happened and also reinvestigating or investigating continually the cold cases. It's quite a big task. It starts to build up very quickly. Homicide investigations cost a lot of money. It used to be that the average was assessed at one point in time to be £1.6 million for homicide investigation. Now, I'm sure that's gone up since the day that the initial assessment was done. But clearly, if you have to reinvestigate a homicide once or twice or 3 or 4 times, that cost goes up. The second point is it's not just a financial cost. It takes police officers and investigators time to reinvestigate, so it takes them away from other investigations, and it impacts on the police's reputation. Clearly, an organisation where the public are relying on them to detect these homicides and bring offenders to justice, if they're not doing so, there's the potential that people will lose confidence in the police, and policing is all about public trust and confidence. And the last point, and perhaps the most important to all of us in society, for every undetected homicide, arguably that leaves the murderer, the offenders, at large in the public. So there's a risk that they might reoffend, commit further murders or other offences. And secondly, that they may also have the opportunity, whilst they're at large, to conceal information and evidence about the murders they've already committed. So there's a kind of a double jeopardy there. Now, public perceptions of senior detectives. I would argue has always been the case historically, that most people, if you don't have a direct encounter with specialist detectives, most of your understanding will come from the media. And these fictional investigators are just that, fictional. In real life, they're not good looking, they don't drive Ferraris, and they don't detect an offence within the hour of TV program. Life isn't like that. The reality is, rather like the gentleman on the left-hand side of the slide, they work long hours. I used to sleep in the office. I would work 3 and 4 and 5 days if I ever had a homicide investigation that was fresh. And clearly you have to act in that time. So the picture on the left, except for the beer bottle, is a fair reflection of you didn't have time to go home and sleep. Now, the impact of that from a well-being point of view is, you can imagine that homicide investigators in this situation very quickly have a high workload. They tend not to be very healthy or eat a healthy diet. And there's an interesting point there, that if they're working like that all the time, is that resulting in a reduction of their ability to act efficiently as a detective? Because we all need sleep and food and rest and a break. Okay, I just want to touch on how society views homicide investigations. As a police officer, I investigated every kind of crime in my 34 years. But in terms of how the public view the police, the way that the police investigate major crime, including murder, that's seen as an index by the public of police competence. If the police do well in those areas, more than other areas, they're seen as doing well, and vice versa. A quotation there is taken from a very well-known member of the public. No greater honour will ever be bestowed on an officer or a more profound duty imposed on them than when they're entrusted with the investigation of the death of a human being. I certainly felt that as a senior investigating officer. I had a relationship with the victim's family. I still talk to victims' families for cases that I worked on. Even now, even though many years later I've retired, there's a tremendous pride in taking on this kind of investigation and obligation. In terms of the skill sets that are required, I can't really go into a lot of detail, but decision making, using scientific methods, logic and reasoning are really important. And that links neatly into, you can be a good detective, but the best possible training and guidance, including higher education, studying academically, anything like that, you need to consider and take advantage of to ensure that you have the best and most current skills available to carry out this task. And one of the things that all police training talks about for homicides is an investigative mindset. It's a process, a mental process by which investigators follow a methodology, but it needs to be maintained and it needs to be updated with new knowledge to be current. And for me, the quotation that always stuck with me throughout my service, there was a particular murder of a schoolgirl called Sarah Payne. You could Google it. It wasn't in Yorkshire. And the mother of this girl addressed senior homicide investigators at a conference in 2006. And she put it most succinctly of all. If you put a step wrong, that's the police, in one of these big cases, you will be guilty for hell freezing over. That just shows to the victims' families how important and how high their expectation is that police officers will deliver on that. So how can justice fail? How can the police make mistakes? One, homicides that are never investigated. Imagine you have a missing from home report, somebody's gone missing. Lots of people go missing regularly. It doesn't mean they are murdered. But for the ones that we never find or never actually are found safe and well, you have to accept as a police officer that potentially some of those are murders, but we never actually found the victim because we didn't, and because we didn't do that, we couldn't record it and investigate it as a homicide. The second group are the cold cases, the ones that are undetected, where we're aware of the murder, but we don't actually succeed in detecting it. But the third and most worrying group to a police officer are what we call wrongful detections. That's where somebody's caught and prosecuted for the murder and brought to justice, but then it turns out it was the wrong person. Now, this isn't always the police trying to, shall we say, fix somebody with the conviction. It can often be simply because the evidence at the time was enough for a jury and a court to convict. and then later evidence or new science can prove that that conviction was unsafe. Now that's a problem for society and the legal system. It's not just something driven by the police. A couple of examples. You may well have heard of Harold Shipman. He was a doctor, very respected. One of the things about homicides is they all start out as what we call an unexplained death. If you're ill with some terminal disease and your doctor knows about it, and after several years of treatment you finally die, it's not likely that your death was unexplained. The doctor will usually say, yes, here's a death certificate. Howard or whoever died of whatever the medical condition was. That doesn't require the police. The police only investigate the ones where that's not the case. But do you see the danger that if a doctor lies about recording those deaths, claiming that they were from natural causes when they weren't, the danger is they never enter the homicide investigative system. And that was Harold Shipman. Throughout his career as a respected doctor, he actually potentially led to the death, the homicide of nearly 250 of his patients. Now, when he was actually brought to justice, the way that the legal system it runs is that we don't always prosecute for every offence, because once you've gone through so many convictions, that there are only so many levels of punishment you can give before you're at kind of 100%. So he actually went to court for 15 charges. He was convicted of those and eventually killed himself. Now, you could say that was a success of the process because it came to light and he was found out. But I'd suggest otherwise. There were 2 inquiries into Harold Shipman. Between the 2 inquiries, we know for sure that Shipman killed 3 more people. It happened even though society and the medical profession had had other cases previously of doctors killing patients and therefore evading a homicide investigation. All the inquiries showed that had the early investigations, which included medical professional bodies, been involved and been proper, then it's highly likely that a significant number of Shipman's victims would still be alive today. So that's where you have an unreported investigation actually letting down true homicide victims. Separate case now. This is one more close to home for me. This is a wrongful conviction. This involves a little girl called Leslie Molseed, who lived in Rochdale, and a gentleman called Stephen Kisco, who also lived in Rochdale. Now, Leslie, when she was aged 11, went missing from home. She'd been sent to the local shop for her mother one Sunday afternoon and never came home. Within 3 days, her body was discovered on moorland above Boothroyd Reservoir, basically on the Yorkshire moors between Yorkshire and Lancashire. So that's the start point of this investigation. You need to understand that this is pre-technology, the kind of computers and mobile phones and media devices we have now, ANPR cameras, closed circuit TV. It was all paper-based. 258 officers were involved in the initial investigation in the first 5 days. And literally within days, they talked to over 12,000 nominals, which are people. They'd taken nearly 5,000 statements. They'd looked at 8,000 vehicles, and an action, which is a line of inquiry, they'd already reached over 10,000. This was a massive inquiry. Another problem for this inquiry was because of the nature of it being a little girl, it alerted the public interest and also the media. So you had basically the media investigating the homicide at the same time as the police were. This was significant later on. Stephen Kisco came into the inquiry. Now, this chap, at the time he was in his 50s, he lived with his mother at home. He was mentally challenged, but not a problem. He lived in society, he worked at the local council, but he was a fairly simple and what we these days we would call a vulnerable person. He was asked to attend the police station at Rochdale voluntarily. He did. Turned up on his own, no solicitor, no appropriate adult, nobody with him. He made a statement admitting the murder. So he was charged with the murder. He was tried at Leeds Crown Court and he was convicted of the murder. Now, what was significant about this conviction? Some key witnesses were teenage girls who were from Rochdale, and they said around the time of the murder that they'd seen Stefan, who was well known locally. He'd walked towards them and he'd exposed his private parts to them. Now, the inference being clearly he was interested in girls and some kind of had some sexual connection. That was a key piece of evidence in the trial. They were all rewarded by the national press. They became famous at the time, and even the judge commended them. So there we are. On the face of it, we've had a horrific murder and it's been detected. Kisco and his mother tried to appeal the conviction. There were all sorts of problems with his confession and the safety of it. Finally, she was able to do that in 1989. So that's more than 12 years after her son was first convicted. And they commenced a new police investigation based on that in 1991. That quickly found that Kisco had a medical condition that meant he couldn't produce sperm. The problem with that was when they'd examined Leslie's body, they had found sperm on her body. So the inference was, if that semen was connected to the murder of Leslie, it clearly wasn't Kisco because he couldn't have deposited it because he was medically incapable of doing that. They also found out that the 4 girls had actually completely fabricated the account of seeing Kisco and him exposing himself to them. They'd completely made it up and lied in court, bearing in mind they were teenagers, because they wanted to be famous and they liked the attention. And their evidence have been critical to the jury convicting Kisco. So basically, he'd gone to jail on false evidence for 4 teenage girls who wished to be famous. They took his liberty, if you will. The second investigation resulted in Kisco being cleared by the appeal court. He was released from custody. He actually was very ill as a result of being in custody. He had a heart condition, and he eventually died of a heart attack in 1993. A year later, his mother died. So this poor man, this harmless gentleman who'd been shuffling around Rochdale living his life, never hurt anybody, had died in prison, been incarcerated for many years. He'd ultimately succumbed to the health issues that created and died. So basically his life was ended as well as Leslie's, and his mother died only a year later. So the whole of the Kisco family became victims alongside Leslie as a result of the wrongful conviction. There was a re-investigation, a third investigation. Now, this was a cold case review, the kind of things that I would used to do. And they reviewed the forensic material that had been retained. However, remember what I said about stuff being lost? By that point, Leslie's original clothing had been destroyed, so there was no clothing to actually forensically examine. Luckily, however, they had a piece of tape, forensic tape, that they'd used to take tapings off stockings that Leslie was wearing at the time her body was found. On that tape was a 4mm piece of human hair. From that human hair, they were able to obtain a DNA profile of a human being. And that turned out not to be DNA from Stefan Kisco. So you could argue that was further conclusive proof that whatever he may have been guilty of, he had nothing to do with Leslie Malseed or her death. But that investigation, that finding, raised problems for the investigation. You have to ask hard questions when you're an investigator. You have to assume that things may not be as they seem. First question for the investigators, did that DNA profile come from semen? Well, in the initial case, no, it didn't. It came from a human hair. But subsequently, they were able to find semen on the taping and say that it did come from semen. So that's a forensic problem. But the second question is an investigative one. Just because this poor girl was found to have semen on her stockings, that doesn't necessarily mean that the semen was related to her death, or that the person who deposited that semen was involved in the homicide in any way. And that was an investigating matter that the officers had to investigate separately. Once that investigation was complete, the problem was they had a DNA profile of a man linked to the victim, but what they didn't have was knowledge of who that person was, who that DNA profile belonged to. Luckily, the National DNA Database, which collects data from DNA from a range of people who come into police custody, a number of years later brought up a match to this gentleman, Ronald Castry, completely out of the blue. He'd been arrested for a road rage incident, driving a car. He hadn't had any, wasn't in relation to any kind of sexual offence. But prior to this coming to light, he had previous convictions for assault and indecent assault on children. And significantly, on the date that Leslie went missing from home, he lived literally half a mile from where she was. So from an investigator's point of view, he was in the proximity, in the same area as where the poor girl was when she went missing. He was subsequently investigated, charged with Leslie's murder, and in 2007, all these years later, convicted of her murder. He was sentenced to a minimum of 30 years imprisonment. What stood out for me is the two things. Firstly, what I've highlighted in red. On the day of his conviction, West Yorkshire Police actually apologised publicly to the Kisco family for his initial wrongful arrest and imprisonment. That's a moral issue, and for me it was very important that the police admitted to the family that they had made mistakes and could have done a better job. Secondly, Kisco's solicitor made a statement, which I've highlighted in purple, at the end of this investigation, saying, what better way to prove a man, Stefan's innocence, than to convict a true murder? So that's the full circle of the process for a wrongful conviction. I'm running out of time, so I just need to conclude with a few points. From a career point of view, in my opinion, the police service is a vocation. It's not a 9-to-5 job. You have to want to do it. It's a good career, secure employment, well paid, but it's very demanding and also very rewarding. When I joined the police in 1981, yes, I really am that old, I had a science degree. At that time, having a degree was the exception. These days, in 2002, it's the rule. If you want to get into the police, you're competing against people, or you will be competing against people who have degrees. During my police service, the police were very good at supporting me as an employee with my further education. During that time, I completed a master's degree and my PhD. So it's not that once you join the police, your education stops, it's continuing. In the current competitive jobs market that we're in, if you're looking for a career in policing or criminology, you might need a good degree. Well, you certainly need a good degree, but I'd suggest to you it needs to be the right degree. It's not just any degree. People with those qualifications should have more success than others in getting and then keeping a job. And once they're in the job, for specialising on for promotion. My personal opinion, as a former police officer, a professional police officer who's now an academic, the best degrees are those that are offered that combine the best of academic theory with professional policing knowledge and experience. And what I would say to you in closing, no degree will make you a good police officer. Life isn't like that. But having a good degree should make you a better one. I was a police officer for 33 years, and I made the use of the skills my education gave me every single day in my role. I've finished now. I'm slightly over time. I apologise. Thank you very much for your attention. And like Ash says, if there are any questions, please come back to me.